All right, so let me introduce our featured speaker, Richard Aboulafia. Now, a number of us at SMA have known Richard since the late 1990s. It's a real treat to have him here at our town hall. Richard has been publishing reports, newsletters, and his unique insights into the aerospace industry and markets, both commercial and military now for, I think, over 3 decades. Now, Richard has advised numerous aerospace companies and financial institutions worldwide and has been considered the leading analyst and seer on the aerospace industry. His most recent article in Forbes on the Russia-Ukraine war and implications for the defense industry I found to be particularly intriguing. So welcome, Richard, and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, thanks so much, AJ and Jock, and boy, great to be on, especially with the run up to this. Boy, that was fantastic. I enjoyed the nose art lecture. You know, I sort of did a little side Google search. My favorite movie about Los Angeles, not a documentary, Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
Yes.
I immediately went to see, is there nose art involving Jessica Rabbit, who of course is sadly there is not. I think
there should be. There should be.
And the whole connection between electronic dance music and running that you highlighted there, AJ, I had no idea. And I assure you, sadly, I have no ability to work EDM to any of my spreadsheet activities.
You know, you can take a master class on EDM, actually.
This is LA, isn't it? I love it.
Yes.
Anyway, delighted to be on. I guess my mandate is to give you this kind of a snapshot of where aero markets are right now in this time of unbelievable chaos. Allow some time for questions. Happy to make this interactive and happy to talk about any programs or markets that you might like to. But I guess I'll start with sort of dividing the big themes of our industry right now into, let's say, 4 different buckets. One is chaos. Another is, believe it or not, good news. You know, this is, I'll take good news, Alex, for 200, please. Another is K-shapes, and another is constraints. So I'm sort of going to divide things up. First of all, yes, AJ, 3 decades, 34 years to be exact, of following programs, industries, and markets. And oh boy, eventually I'll learn something about this. And I've never seen anything like this, right? I mean, we had the Max disaster, chaos, followed by, oh God, this pandemic thing. And my desk is littered with masks I might have used over the past. I mean, that's the worst shock to the commercial aerospace industry ever. Now we have the horror and atrocity in the Ukraine, of course. Somewhere over the past few years, you have to factor in China decoupling from the West. And of course, the odd terrible plane crash or disaster like the one earlier this week. I've never seen anything like this. And in terms of almost like a bookends of my career, not that I'm planning on retiring anytime soon, but you know, when I started my career, I was in grad school looking at ways to destroy the Red Army. It was the late Cold War. And then of course it all came down. We were in this wonderful multi-decade holiday from history in which commercial aviation did rather well in the broader scheme of things, but defense collapsed. And here we are now with defense coming roaring back for many understandable reasons. It almost feels like, you know, I again don't want to say at the end of my career, but when it began 34 years ago, it was the opposite, and now it appears to be raising up. Having said that, let's get on to the second area after the chaos of it all, which is, believe it or not, more good news. Not to say that, you know, we can always thrive on chaos, like the old management help book says, but given the circumstances, we as an industry are actually doing really well. Now, part of it, of course, is the massive increase in defense budgets that's been sort of percolating over the past 2 years, but over the past 2 months has all of a sudden produced this breakneck upward momentum. But even if you factor that out, if you had told me, I left LA, I was at the Speed News conference, in March 2020, went home and boy, half the plane was empty and nothing good was happening. If you had told me that the jetliner business and the business jet industry would be in the shape they're in now, I'd have said you were nuts. We've come through this far better than I ever would have imagined. So pretty much any part of the industry, with one exception, which is long-range international jetliners, that is to say, twin-aisle jetliners. That's about the only industry or only subsegment of our industry that keeps me up at night. That's the only one. Everything else is doing just great. A definite positive surprise in so many ways. Now, twin-aisle jets basically fell by about 50%, driven by this hideous mix. You've got international demand that was hit hardest and is taking the longest to recover in the airline business. That's not going to change. And if anything, the Russia crisis is only making it that much worse. The second is you had an existing overcapacity situation with twin aisles. And then third, you had a secular shift in fleet planning among many airlines from twins towards singles, even for transatlantic routes. I knew something was up when I flew from Heathrow to Halifax in a 737 back a few years ago. These routes are now proliferating, Fragmentation, basically, it just keeps going downward. Things are getting smaller and thinner. All of this is produced, well, let's bring up the third thing I wanted to talk about, which is the K-shape. The K-shape is exactly that. It is bifurcation. It is market trend splitting when they shouldn't be splitting. So for example, during the pandemic, you had this remarkable recovery in domestic traffic, while international traffic just kind of kept sinking. Similarly, you had much stronger numbers in private air travel, Part 91K, Part 135, relative to scheduled air. You had this effect, this K-shaped effect, in so many different segments, the developed market versus the emerging market, singles versus twins. This bifurcation just sort of happened. And we had seen examples of market bifurcation before, like, for example, over the previous decade, high-end business jets had done extremely well, whereas small and medium cabin segments just sort of stagnated. So this kind of weird bifurcation effect, it appears to be, if anything, getting more intense. And that brings to sort of a subsegment of this. The one big theme that I think has come out of this pandemic is that there's very little new. A lot of it is just an acceleration of pre-existing trends and conditions. Basically, if you went in strong, you got stronger. If you went in weak, you got weaker. There are so many things that merely, the search for alternative propulsion that got stronger. You had existing companies that were under pressure. Well, they got even more under pressure. And you had stronger companies, strong companies that were outperforming, I don't know, like Northrop Grumman or Airbus or Lockheed Martin, that just got stronger still. It was a very strange situation. You see this societally too. I think, the macroeconomists out there you talk to say that, the wealth got wealthier and the rich and the poor got poorer. This was unfortunately something that accelerated inequality. So you've got that acceleration of pre-existing trends making those K-shapes in society even worse. That's sort of my big overarching theme to explain everything. Now, the fourth issue I'd like to discuss are constraints, which is something I never in a million years, well, if you had said two years ago that the biggest problem we're going to have as an industry 2 years from now are industry bottlenecks and constraints that are going to keep a damper on production. Again, one of us has to go to a loony bin. That makes no sense, but here we are. And this is hitting the industry in so many ways. obviously, most recently, we're facing a problem with titanium, of course, because somewhere between a third and a half, not just of the sponge raw stuff comes from Russia, but something like a similar percentage of castings and forgings comes from giant mills over there. So, there are a lot of companies that are ramping up and have offered to ramp up, like ATI and Toho and Inspirion and folks like that. But it's going to take a while. The lead time associated with this kind of capability is in years, not months, not weeks, years. That's an issue. Similarly, as you know, the defense industry, AJ, those of us who were there back in the 90s, remember the massive wave of consolidation. Well, it's not like a whole lot of other people have come online. Yes, General Atomics has joined the club. Every so often you hear of someone like Kratos joining the club. Very few people join the club. So what you've got is an industry that in many ways is geared for the aftermath of the Cold War, suddenly coping with the demands and challenges of a new Cold War. And that is a series of bottlenecks and constraints in and of itself. That my favorite example of that, the market right now for the Joint Strike Fighter is probably pushing 200 a year. And obviously, most recently, Germany and Finland have joined and Switzerland have joined. Basically, they see it as a good way to get situational awareness of a contested battle space, as well as to cement a strategic relationship with the US and other NATO countries. But because of production constraints, we're limited to about 156 per year, not 190, not 200, 156. That's the number. We're only talking about the mix. So how quickly can that be made good? I don't know. But you're seeing this show up in so many ways. My favorite other factoid is that when Germany announced that it would be going from 1.3% of GDP on defense to 2%, and with an emergency upfront of 100 billion euros, just like that, have some money. We need defense, it turns out. Holiday from history is over. Let's get to work. And there are very few German companies that are in defense anymore.
Yep. Right.
So my favorite was Hensoldt, which is their national defense electronics house. The share price went from 12 euros to 26 euros in about 5 days. I mean, all of a sudden, everybody that is sitting on a defense property, if you will, is in a very good position. And then you have all the other stuff that you typically see in difficult times, castings and forgings, not just of titanium, but of all sorts of exotic metals, the more elaborate interiors work, things like that, that could put a brake on single aisle jetliner production ramps. You're seeing this across the board. And this is, I think, the first time in a very long while we're actually seeing that kind of supply constraint imposed upon industry rather than a market constraint. I don't like that. I'm a market guy. I want a job, right? I mean, if it's a production constraint, I'm not so sure what I can do. And you also have this problem that for a lot of people, not surprisingly, the pandemic was an enormous gut punch. And you had suppliers, especially in the second and third tier, basically they did, this is a point my good friend Kevin Michaels always makes, it's a great point. The only way that we didn't have mass bankruptcies during this pandemic was because everybody pulled every switch and lever to get through it. They fired a bunch of people, closed a bunch of facilities, sold off anything that couldn't be sold off, and of course filled up their debt revolvers. Loaded up on debt. All right, now it's time to ramp up. Can they get access to the working capital? I mean, that's a big question mark as we look at the supply constraints moving forward. And then, of course, finally, as always, whether it's in a downturn or an upturn, so much of this, because of that chaos, to bring us back to the chaos issue up front, so much of it comes down to your portfolio as a supplier, and you get some companies that are unusually or anomalously, I guess is the word, weak, and some that are just ridiculously strong. Like, Hensoldt, okay, we're a German defense prime in a country without a lot of defense. And that bifurcation alone is producing yet another K-shaped aspect to this recovery. So there are many, many aspects to this industry I find fascinating now. But in general, this is a far better time and place, despite the chaos of the world, despite the human tragedies that occasionally unfold around us, like in Ukraine now. We're doing pretty well as an industry. And that to me is unexpected and fascinating. And I sure hope it continues.
Wow.
So perhaps I'll turn it back over to you and Jay and Jock.
Indeed. So thank you so much, Richard. You've touched on so many things that I actually have a ton of questions about.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a number of questions in the chat. So why don't we first do a couple of those?
Yeah. So the first one is things are moving quickly in the AAM/UAM markets. In your opinion, when will we be able to take an air taxi or my favorite restaurant in LA and miss the traffic? I love that question, by the way.
Uber Air.
Uber Air.
Yeah, well, my other favorite Los Angeles movie, of course, is Blade Runner, and I want Deckard's car, the flying one.
Right.
I don't want to throw cold water on the UAM craze, and it's fascinating that in this space you've got 275, I think, wannabes.
Yep.
I don't know how this plays out. I mean, there are so many regulatory and market factors, but fundamentally, I just have to ask, when was the last time you were given exclusive personal use of any machine that costs about $4 or $5 million? Because it doesn't happen to me too often. I consider myself pretty fortunate in life. And, the Uber I get in, I'm reckoning it has an economic value of maybe 10K. If I decided to start I live in Northwest Washington, a lot of rich people here, I can tell you, looking out my window. And if I started a Rolls-Royce car service, which I'm sure people would be interested, those things only cost like, what, 10% of that?
Right.
I think people are so focused upon the cost reductions associated with electrification, which are good, and maybe even automation, that they're neglecting capital cost.
Right.
It's a good point.
Yeah, it is a good point.
That's a good point. It may have nothing to do with technology, but everything about the asset value.
Right.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Let's take another question.
Yes. Let's see here. Well, so this is kind of a follow-up to what you were just talking about, but it says, what is your view about electric airplanes, and does it need some technical revolution?
Yeah, I think in terms of energy density, we simply need a whole new breed of battery chemistry.
Absolutely.
And, I don't know what the development roadmap is like. My good friend Alan Epstein, who's at MIT, I think he's one of the co-heads of their aeronautics department, but he has a number of very depressing presentations that basically say we just don't get there. And I want to believe, but I keep coming back to the idea that we might be the last industry on the planet to decarbonize, I'm afraid.
Wow.
Well, I think you're right about that. I've been saying for a long time, until there's a revolution in battery technology,
and chemistry is chemistry, pretty well understood now for a couple of centuries.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking for that AAA size nuclear generator.
Wow. So
I think my kids have one there, Jacques. So I'll look at it.
So let me throw in a question or just a comment.
Sure.
I love your analogy of the K-shape. I hadn't thought about this before, but this bifurcation is occurring at so many different levels, whether it's at markets or wealth or just other aspects. I think the long-term implications of this are going to be pretty significant for all of us, whether you're thinking about us individually or thinking about the business you're running or the markets that you might be wanting to pursue. That's really a fascinating topic there, in terms of your comment, in terms of having actually seen this level of bifurcation occurring in markets. I mean, I guess we've seen I guess particularly starting with your comments on the twin aisle versus single aisle, right? where all of a sudden those markets started to move dramatically different a while back.
Pre-COVID, actually.
Yeah. And then, all the way to kind of what's happened to personal wealth, and I think what particularly hit me is the stronger got stronger, the strong got stronger, and the weaker just simply got weaker. And I think that actually will ultimately have a very significant impact on pace of innovation, on lots of things that unfortunately will be perhaps more of a negative impact on in terms of how, to what degree we're going to see more and more innovation, whether it's in the commercial market or in the defense markets. One question about this increase in defense spending and the budgets. My view is that most of it in the near term will go to OCO type activities, or overseas contingency operations. Do you think there's going to be, like we had post 9/11, another kind of explosion around the creation of new programs? There was a huge number of new programs that were created. Post 9/11. Do you put on take your crystal ball out? Do you kind of see a similar type of situation, or is it going to be different this time?
Well, yeah, I think here again, you're seeing the acceleration of pre-existing trends and conditions. We'd already been pivoting away from counterinsurgency, small wars, nation building, whatever, towards peer adversary force structure development. That's obviously accelerating because now there are two. Before China, and now it's, oh, right, Romney might have had a point. That accelerates the new programs. In particular, don't forget, B-21 is a complex of systems. Don't forget, NGAD is a complex of systems. Don't forget that many of the stealth strike, long range, boutique production prototyping, they're all complex of systems. Hypersonics, a complex of systems. In other words, it's more than just new programs, AJ. It's almost like a metastasization along various different families and whatever that's going to produce. As a matter of fact, it's just landed, the new budget. And, we've just been looking at a record of 119 billion in R&D. The new budget's 130.
Yep.
I mean, what does that tell you about new programs, right? I mean, that's all you need to know. It's going to be an absolute, and is it going to go to 140? Yeah, probably, right? I think the biggest concern we have here, again, are constraints in the number of engineers. And, that's going to be a challenge too. So I'm a huge believer in new programs to meet what is it, my favorite, again, getting back to the F-35 situation, it's great. It's going to have an amazing decade. It's really not the right plane. The right plane is something in the F-22 class, both for range and speed and performance and time to climb.
Right.
That argues for super NGAD plus all of its associates, Tempest, FCAS in Europe, whatever else, maybe something from Japan. They're looking at that. We're all looking at a proliferation of new programs.
Yeah, that's interesting. You bring up the F-22, which we all know got curtailed with a pretty significant tail of costs. Yep. Perhaps now we should be rethinking that decision again. Wow. So we're in the right business then.
Well, at least I think so, AJ.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, Richard, it was fantastic having you on. Any last comments that we should all kind of be thinking about as we kind of move forward in terms of kind of think about the markets or defense markets specifically?
Well, what can I say? Things are good. Obviously, this industry can turn on a dime. In my view, we're returning to history as it was. I tend to regard this as a super cycle with a decade ahead of upward momentum, accompanied hopefully by a return to commercial market health. That's also good there. So overall, again, with the caveat that the world is filled with risk and difficulty, I'm pretty darn optimistic about the future of the industry. And I can't thank you enough for having me on.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. You've been very generous with your time, and we're very fortunate to have you on. So
yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard.